Coming up at New Day at Arirang. 2 weeks into the Living with COVID-19 scheme, South Korea is set for more than 3,000 new COVID-19 infections Wednesday, surpassing the 3,000 mark for only the second time. A virtual meeting between the leaders of the U.S. and China has taken place, with Presidents Biden and Xi stressing the need to properly manage their relationship to fend off any possible conflict. However, tensions remain over the issue of Taiwan. And South Korea's Son Heung-min scored his 30th goal for his country Tuesday, helping the Taeguk Warriors to a comfortable 3-0 win against Iraq in their latest qualifying match for the 2022 World Cup.
Good morning and welcome to New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. on Wednesday, November 17th here in Seoul, South Korea. I'm Mark Broom.
And I'm Kim Mo-gen. It's great to have you as we head into the middle of the week. Over the next hour or so, we're going to take a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world.
We're going to start with coronavirus, where we start most days, I'm afraid. South Korea may see more than 3,000 new cases on Wednesday. That would be the second highest figure since the start of the pandemic here in the country. Also on Wednesday, health authorities will announce emergency plans and changes to the booster shot campaign in a bid to try and address the climb in infections as well as those people who are critically ill.
Now, to fill us in with more COVID-19 related updates, we have a reporter, Yeon-sung, in the studio. Good morning, Yeon-sung.
Good morning.
So let's start with the infection numbers for today. Can you tell us more on that?
Well, unfortunately, South Korea saw quite the jump last night, almost 1,000 cases up from Monday night. So up until 9 p.m. Tuesday, authorities tracked more than 2,800 new COVID-19 infections. This is actually the highest late-night tally reported since September. There's a high chance that Wednesday's morning official caseload will rise above 3,000, the second time that the official tally has hit that 3,000 mark since the onset of the pandemic. Infections in the Seoul capital region made up almost 85% of the cases recorded on Tuesday night, with Seoul City's cases marking a new record high, 1,380 infections in less than 24 hours.
Yeah, I seem to remember us reporting that we weren't going to talk about the total number of cases anymore, but that seems to have gone completely out of the window. But in regards to the capital, that's where the real concentration of cases is, as you would imagine, since it's the most densely populated place in the entire country, Seoul and its surrounding areas. But there is an issue with ICU beds and the supply of those, because you need very special equipment to treat people who are seriously ill with COVID-19. In terms of the number of people who are critically ill, what can you tell us about that?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the critically ill cases because they're also an impending problem. Health authorities had mentioned earlier that one of the warning signs showing that the country is moving into a dangerous level is if there were more than 500 critical cases per day. And it seems like the country is edging in closer to that point. On Tuesday, 495 patients were reported to be in critical condition, which is also a new record. Authorities are devising an emergency plan to address the steps they will take if the current situation escalates. This plan will be announced this afternoon. They've actually rescheduled this announcement a few times now, but in the event that they don't shift the dates again, I'll be able to give an update on the full plan during tomorrow morning's newscast, so stay tuned.
Well, alongside that plan, I heard that there's going to be another announcement today, right?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Health authorities are also making changes to the booster shot campaign. So they will actually shorten the interval between the primary and the booster vaccine doses. They're hoping to tackle the growing number of severe infections among the elderly and those with fading immunity.
While there are only 8% of people in their 60s and over who are not fully vaccinated, they made up 61.7% of the total 452 deaths from October 3rd to November 6th.
So in other words, unvaccinated people in higher age groups only make up around 3% of the country's population, but more than 60% of the COVID-19 related deaths. Currently, the booster shot campaign recommends most recipients get their top-up shot 6 months after being fully vaccinated. But the new plan will most likely recommend people in their 60s and over get their extra jab at least 4 months later. and people in their 50s to get theirs at least 5 months after full inoculation.
Okay, so you're giving us a comprehensive overview of what the situation is like in South Korea, but let's broaden our scope to talk about what's going on in the world in regards to this pandemic, and especially in regards to treatment for COVID-19. What's happening there?
Well, I want to talk about one of the game-changing pills named Paxlovid. Pfizer has signed a deal that will allow generic versions of their COVID-19 oral pills named Paxlovid to be licensed to 95 low to middle income countries. Although the drug has not yet been distributed to the public, it has shown promising results in clinical trials and is seen as potential game changers. The company is hoping that this drug will play a critical role in quelling the pandemic and saving lives in those lower income countries where more than half of the world's population live. The drug is expected to be priced at around $700, but in lower income countries, that price tag will most likely be brought down. Pfizer's move, however, has been met with some criticism that some of the hardest hit countries, like Russia, Turkey, and Brazil, are not included in this deal.
All right, Yunxing, thank you for that report. We hope to talk to you again tomorrow with more updates.
Now, tomorrow is going to be a big day for lots of young people here in South Korea, the biggest day of their lives, arguably. So as this battle goes on with COVID-19, South Korea is set for another massive national event on Thursday. This time it is the annual college entrance exam known in South Korea as the Suneung test, which covers numerous subjects and stretches over several hours. So a very stressful period for students. That is happening tomorrow.
Yes. The day before the big event, test takers will visit their test sites to check the location and to receive their identification slips. Now, with just 24 hours remaining, our Kim Hyo-san tells us what the test takers are being urged to keep in mind. Face masks will be mandatory for all test takers of the college entrance exam that takes place across South Korea on November 18th. This year's test is the second since the onset of the pandemic. While the students are permitted to wear ordinary disposable hygiene masks, they are advised to wear government-certified medical masks such as KF94, KF80, or KFAD. Masks with valves and those made out of mesh are not allowed as they do not effectively block respiratory droplets. Test takers who have COVID-19 or are in self-quarantine for possible exposure have already been assigned to separate testing sites and will be required to wear KF94 masks.
The fact high school seniors have been inoculated and will have no dividers at test sites means we've already come a long way compared to last year.
Test takers will be asked to install the plastic dividers on their desks before lunch, which they'll be asked to return once they've finished eating. As there will be no water purifiers, test takers need to bring their own water along with a packed lunch. They're also advised to wear extra warm clothes since windows will be opened every hour to ensure the natural flow of air to minimize the risk of COVID-19 infection. Test takers should also note that all electronic devices are prohibited at test centers, and that includes smartphones and micro-sized wireless earphones. Kim Hyo-san, Arirang News. In other news, the leaders of the world's two superpowers, the United States and China, have held their first summit, but rather than it being face-to-face, it all happened via video call. Both Presidents Biden and Xi used the opportunity to stress the importance of carefully managing the relationship to prevent potential flare-ups. While tensions remain in certain areas, the talks with Beijing were the most substantial since Biden took office at the start of the year. Our Yoon Jung-min reports.
In their first virtual meeting, U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping emphasized the need for managing their competition responsibly to avoid conflict. The meeting was held on Monday evening Washington time and Tuesday morning Beijing time.
It seems to me our responsibility as leaders of China and the United States is to ensure that the competition between our countries does not veer into conflict, whether intended or unintended. Just simple, straightforward competition.
Stressing an open and candid relationship, Biden added they need to establish some common sense guardrails to be clear where they agree and disagree for responsible world leadership. He emphasized all countries have to play by the same rules, and the U.S. is going to stand up for their interests and values as well as those of its allies and partners. Xi stressed the importance of a steady China-U.S. relationship in that the two countries have international responsibilities for world peace and cooperation against climate change and the pandemic.
China and the United States could respect each other, coexist in peace, and pursue win-win cooperation. I stand ready to work with you, Mr. President, to build consensus, take active steps, and move China-U.S. relations forward in a positive direction.
They began their candid talks right after a brief friendly greeting as Biden thanked Xi for his congratulatory call following his election last year, and Xi calling Biden his old friend. The meeting lasted for over 3 hours. In a readout, the White House said Biden underscored that the U.S. remains committed to the One China policy regarding Taiwan. Biden made clear that Washington strongly opposes unilateral efforts to change the status quo or undermine peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. Xi warned against Taiwan's independence and said Beijing will inevitably take stern action if anyone crosses its so-called red line. He said new tensions are forming in the region because of Taiwan's move for independence with U.S. support, adding, "It's like playing with fire, and those who play with fire will be burned to death." As for other issues, Biden also raised concerns about China's practices in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, and human rights issues. He also touched upon China's unfair trade practices, global energy supplies, and the free and open Indo-Pacific. Also discussed were regional issues, including North Korea, Afghanistan, and Iran. Jong-un, Arirang News.
A senior U.S. official says North Korea is one key area where the U.S. and China can and could and should cooperate on. Speaking in a webinar on Tuesday on the outcome of the Biden-Xi summit, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said coordination is very important when addressing the North Korean nuclear issue. Sullivan also reiterated the Biden administration's commitment to engage in diplomatic dialogue with the North. He added Biden and Xi exchanged views on other global challenges, including Afghanistan and climate change. Net worth across the 10 countries that make up 60% of the world's GDP has tripled since the year 2000. The report by McKinsey Global Institute says net worth grew from $160 trillion in 2000 to over $500 trillion in 2020. However, the report says the increase reflects valuation gains in real assets, especially real estate, instead of investment in productive assets that drive economies. China's wealth surpassed the US, with $120 trillion jumping from a mere $7 trillion in 2000. Now we cross over to our OCR for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Mark. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. The very much anticipated virtual meeting between US and Chinese Presidents Joe Biden and Xi Jinping took place Monday evening US time. Now, amid this heated rivalry and soaring tensions that we've seen between the two superpower countries over trade, technology, geopolitics and ideology, the leaders reportedly had a healthy debate, but as expected, without a breakthrough. But was the face-to-face virtual meeting of the two personalities meaningful all the same? We have an in-depth discussion ready for you with Dennis Wang, Associate Professor at Sam Houston State University, and Aaron Friedberg, Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. Very warm welcome to you both. Let's start with you, Professor Wang. Now, as the White House said before the summit took place, there were no major agreements or a joint statement that came out of this virtual meeting, so they were really downplaying the possible outcomes of this meeting. But would you say it was still progress?
Oh yeah, of course. I think there's still progress, especially if you look at this, the summit from two different angles. One is symbolic angle, and another one is a practical understanding. The symbolic way is that everyone look at watching this summit because all the country in the world worry that the China U.S. will lead the world to the so-called new Cold War. So before the summit, everyone worried, and then after the summit, the symbolic achievement is that we all know the U.S. China is not intentionally to take this or the world system to a more confrontational situation. So there's no new Cold War. So for a practical meaning, we can look at how these two leaders talk to each other. The friendly atmosphere is actually creating a possibility in the future. They may have more discussion and more negotiation, especially if you understand how to deal with China. Well, you have to get the senior leader, the leader, to agree, to willing to talk to each other, to talk to other country. So after this summit, we can probably predict that different level of communication, different level of negotiation can start proceed. So we can have a better optimistic prediction in the future. Although there's no obvious breakthrough at this moment, but as I mentioned, symbolically speaking, we see more friendly relations between U.S. China, and practically we see potential in the future the U.S. China will have some negotiation and some kind of policy debate or discussion.
Right. So it looks like these two countries, both countries went into the virtual summit without expectations of a breakthrough. But Professor Friedberg, what do you think President Biden and Xi wanted to get out of this meeting or convey to the other side?
I think on the U.S. side, there was a desire to communicate an intention to open dialogue and continue to talk, to indicate that the U.S. side at least has no intention of ratcheting up tensions, and presumably on the Chinese side something similar. I agree that there's some symbolic significance to their discussion, but I don't think that there is anything much of substance that was accomplished. And I don't think, and this is the most important point, that a meeting like this changes the fundamentals of the relationship, which in my view are leading them towards more intense competition in the future.
Well, Professor Friedberg, the atmosphere seemed nothing like the very acrimonious mood between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Alaska earlier this year in the very first government-level meeting under the Biden administration. And while President Xi Jinping, he even said that it was good to see his old friend, President Joe Biden. Do you think this has really reset the tone for bilateral engagement?
It has improved it somewhat. I don't think it's a change of great substance. If you think about these kinds of meetings, there's sort of three possibilities. One, they can be acrimonious, which the meeting in Alaska was, although that was between lower level officials, not national leaders. At the other extreme, they can be substantive and result in actual agreements and progress on specific issues, and that's not what this was. Or something in between. They can be an exchange of views, more or less cordial, that's intended to promote an atmosphere of dialogue and so on. I think that was the point of this meeting, and that's essentially what it accomplished. It doesn't seem that either side went into the meeting with a specific agenda of things that it wanted to achieve. Also, clearly, neither of these two leaders is particularly confrontational. It would have been surprising if they had debated or argued in the way that their subordinates did in Alaska. So it's about what one would have expected.
Right, so despite these surprising pleasantries, it seems that both Mr. Biden and Mr. Xi, they won't be budging on their stances on fundamental issues, particularly the flashpoint issue of Taiwan. And ahead of the summit, both countries exchanged stern warnings over the island, and President Biden reportedly told his counterpart not to undermine peace in Taiwan. And while Professor Wang, now Mr. Biden, he caused some confusion in recent weeks with his remark that Washington would come to Taiwan's defense against Beijing. Do you think the US is going to continue to show strategic uncertainty?
Yes, indeed. I think President Biden recently mentioned like Taiwan agreement or the commitment to Taiwan is kind of because, like you mentioned, the confusion. But fundamentally, the strategic ambiguity is a long-term policy for U.S.-Taiwan relations, and it will continue. And President Biden noticed that this is important, like fundamental foundation for the U.S.-China-Taiwan relations. Most of people in recent years, especially in response to the recent Chinese actions in the Taiwan Strait, people people questions whether the strategic ambiguity is still appropriate for the U.S.-Taiwan relations, whether U.S. should show more like strategic clarity, leaning toward like supporting or counter Taiwan's defense, whether that will be helpful. But in fact, it's best of U.S. interest is to keep this ambiguity because that will keep the both sides of Taiwan Strait unsatisfied. As I mentioned, it's imperfectly, fit with what people need across Taiwan Strait, imperfectly fit also the U.S. interest. So the strategic ambiguity will make sure that Taiwan will continue to do the job and also continue to have like workable relations with the U.S. Same thing, the strategic ambiguity will make the PRC, willing to continue to negotiate and talk to the U.S. government. So there, in the foreseeable future, I don't foresee that any change will come to like I don't foresee any change in terms of strategic ambiguity. Strategic clarity is not good for any part of the Taiwan Strait.
I'd like to get your thoughts on this, Professor Friedberg. I mean, amid this, a couple of weeks ago, we heard from a Pentagon report that the Chinese military, it's been rapidly expanding and it's modernizing and it's intending to coerce Taiwan into unification talks by 2027. Do you think Washington can continue its policy of strategic uncertainty, or do you think it's going to have to perhaps take a clearer stance?
I think the policy of strategic ambiguity as a declaratory policy is going to continue because there is no obvious advantage from the U.S. side to changing it. There's no desire to provoke Beijing unnecessarily. At the same time, I think what's really important is the shifting balance of military power across the strait. And China has been building up its military over a period now of 3 decades. With focus on preparing for possible use of force against Taiwan. The other thing that's worth mentioning is if there have been heightened tensions across the strait in the last 6 to 8 months, it's because of what China has been doing, flying aircraft towards Taiwan, moving ships towards the island. So China's behavior has been more aggressive and threatening. That's why there's tension. On the U.S. side, although I don't expect to see any change in the declaratory policy of strategic ambiguity, I also expect that we're going to see more efforts on the part of the United States and other countries too to help Taiwan strengthen its capacity for self-defense, and also I think to signal to the mainland that if it does use force, even though there's no explicit guarantee, it's quite likely that the United States and other countries too would come in on the side of Taiwan. Australian Defense Minister said a couple of days ago that if there were a conflict over Taiwan, it's unthinkable that Australia would not assist the United States in helping Taiwan. Japanese officials have also talked about this contingency. So the declaratory policy isn't going to change, but the arms competition and the attempt to maintain a stable balance of power on the part of U.S. and Taiwan is going to continue because China is not going to stop expanding its military capabilities, and it's not going to stop threatening Taiwan.
And Professor Friedberg, well, regardless of Washington and Beijing's efforts to ease tensions, do you think the U.S. should continue to look beyond its relationship with China in order to reinforce infrastructure and economic partnerships in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's extremely important. It's important for economic reasons. It's important also for strategic reasons. One of the things that's notable, although there are many changes in tone and atmosphere between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, is that at least for the moment, the Biden administration has continued most of the policies that the Trump administration put into place regarding the Asia Pacific. So an emphasis on strengthening the Indo-Pacific, working with U.S. allies and partners, strengthening U.S. military capabilities in the region, developing stronger economic ties. I think all of that is going to go forward. And again, it's part of a larger ongoing competition between the United States and its partners on the one hand and China on the other to determine in the long run who is going to have the dominant voice in the politics of the region. And the United States has made clear that it's not going to back away. And China, for its part, has made clear its intention to continue to expand its influence and attain what its leaders think is its rightful place in the region. So that's really the undercurrent that's important here, and more important than one meeting or the other, or one declaratory policy or the other. This has been going on for several decades, and it's going to continue.
And Professor Wang, well, there's a lot of uneasiness and nervousness around trade issues surrounding the US and China, of course, here in the Indo-Pacific. Do you think Washington is going to continue decoupling from China and really reinforcing its initiatives in the region, such as Quad and possibly Quad Plus?
Yes, of course. I think U.S. will continue decoupling with China. Well, even after the summit, as I mentioned, well, even the ultimate sphere is more friendly at this moment. But the relationship between U.S.-China fundamentally is still competition. It's the long-term, ongoing, like Professor Fredberg mentioned, it's ongoing competition, and it will get worse and get more intense for sure, because China is rising. China believe they're rising. So there will be a lot of competition and intensify that. And also the way the U.S. dealing with China, the coping policy, the only concern is that the Biden administration need to be very careful and, have maybe have more strategic, consideration, because the current highly interdependence, relations situation between U.S. China is something for U.S. to consider. Why? Because if you look at the trade number from since this, starting this year from January to now September, the trade number, the total amount for trade, between U.S. China is now $465 billion, which is record high. And if you, in comparison to previous 2 years, this year the projected total amount for this year is going to exceeds 700 billion. That will be probably the highest in recent years. What I'm saying is, the U.S.-China relation will fundamentally continue to compete against each other, and the coping policy is what the Biden administration certainly need to continue. But at the same time, they also have to consider how to deal with the domestic economic situation and development, because that is actually affect how Biden administration will continue to win the election, especially the 2022 midterm election is on the way.
And finally, before we go, Professor Friedberg, with President Xi having solidified his leadership over the Chinese Communist Party and his status as forever president for the country, what do you think this means for his US policy in the long run? Do you think he's simply going to wait out the Biden administration on key issues of concern?
I don't know that he's going to wait out the administration. I think he's going to push ahead with the policies that he's been pursuing, which I think he believes have been successful. Chinese strategic analysts and policymakers appear to believe that the United States has entered into a relative decline in its power, and that China is going to continue to rise, that it's time for China to push more assertively to advance towards its objectives, both in the Indo-Pacific region and in the world. I don't think from a Chinese perspective it matters all that much who the leaders are in the United States. I think they tend to view this relationship as being shaped by larger historical forces. The leaders matter somewhat, but they don't make the decisive difference. I think from the point of view of Beijing, this competition is intensifying, and Xi Jinping has a clear attitude towards it and intends to push forward as hard as he possibly can, regardless of who's in the White House. He may think, and his advisors may think, that the Biden administration is going to be relatively weak. He may think that it's not going to last for more than 3 years, and that perhaps a Republican will come back, and maybe even Donald Trump. In that case, maybe he might be inclined to push even harder to achieve some of the things that he wants to over the next 3 years. But overall, I don't think who's president makes that much difference to his calculations.
Well, I'm afraid this is all we have time for today. That was Dennis Wang, Associate Professor at Sam Houston State University, and Aaron Friedberg, Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. Thank you both so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has made his first public appearance in more than a month. Watchers say Kim's appearance is likely aimed at highlighting the regime's internal economic achievements before the year's end and marking a decade of his rule. Kim Dami tells us more.
After keeping a low profile for over a month, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un was back in the public eye in a visit to the regime's northwestern city of Samjiyon. Kim made his last public appearance at the North's Rare Defense exhibition last month. Located at the foot of Mount Baekju, Samjiyon is known to be the birthplace of Kim's late father Kim Jong-il, and developing the city has been one of Kim Jong-un's pet projects since 2018. The North State media reported Tuesday that Kim praised officials for their loyalty to the project, adding that construction will wrap up this year. Watchers call the move a way of showing achievements ahead of the end of the first year of the 5-year economic development plan, as well as the 10th anniversary of the Kim Jong-un regime.
The visit also has to do with development of rural areas. Kim Jong-un has put balanced regional development as an important policy, and the Samjiyon project is a symbol that his policies are working.
Meanwhile, Pyongyang announced on Monday it is set for the Conference of Three Revolutions of Frontrunners, where the regime puts forward practical examples for a revolution in ideological, technological, and cultural fields. The event will take place after just 6 years, an unusual step considering the North had previously staged a meeting every decade. While Seoul's Unification Ministry points out these activities are a part of the North's efforts to solidify internal unity to carry out planned tasks, analysts say Kim is expected to put external affairs on hold until the end of the year and instead focus on internal matters. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
And finally, some good news to report on the urea water solution shortage in South Korea. Domestic production of the fluid used to power diesel vehicles is on the rise. At over 600,000 liters Tuesday, it's more than the average amount used each day. The government plans to start distributing it nationwide without delay. Choi Won-jong reports.
Production of urea water solution in South Korea is gradually gathering pace. Officials announced Tuesday that around 683,000 liters were produced on Monday, which is for the first time larger than what's used per day on average. The supply has been delivered to more than 100 designated gas stations across the country, and even more will be made available for the general public. Despite the current shortage, officials are predicting to see more urea arriving from China soon. According to Seoul's Foreign Ministry, more than 11,000 tons are waiting to go through custom clearance procedures in China. Meanwhile, the Health Ministry officials said that more than 4,000 liters imported from Australia will first be delivered to emergency medical service vehicles, meaning ambulances will be able to run for at least 2 more months for now. The Korean government is also expanding its list of designated gas stations to make urea water solution more available to the public, updating on urea supply levels twice a day online. Starting Tuesday, the head of the Office for Government Policy Coordination will make 1,400 gas stations available for consumers to purchase the fluid. Previously, it was only available at 100 gas stations across the country, but adjustments have been made due to extremely high demand. To help ease the shortage, authorities are also looking into making industrial urea water solution available for regular passenger vehicles. But the National Institute of Environmental Policy said additional test trials need to be carried out first due to safety reasons and because of exhaust emission levels. Further results are expected to be released next week. Choi Won-jong, Arirang News.
Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. In recent weeks, crude oil prices have soared past $80 a barrel as demand far outpaces supply. A couple of weeks ago, OPEC and its oil-producing allies, known as OPEC Plus, put a hold to their current output levels, saying they are not going to loosen the taps despite the skyrocketing prices and pressure from the United States for them to cool the market.
For more, we connect to Philip Van, Senior Managing Analyst for Asia Oil Market Insight and S&P Global Platts, to discuss the recent price surge in oil and how it impacts consumers. Thank you for coming in, Philip.
Good morning. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Now, firstly, what can the U.S. or anyone else outside of the OPEC do to bring oil prices down? And can you explain why OPEC is flatly dismissing the Biden administration's calls for them to fire up output?
Right. Outside of OPEC, I'd say probably the US and perhaps Brazil. Now, US is probably one of the very few non-OPEC producers with capacity and capability to boost production by 1 million barrels a day or more in a relatively prompt manner, let's say within a year. Rising prices have definitely revived US shale activity. And certainly the rising rig numbers are a good indication that US oil production could once again reach the peak output level of about 30 million barrels a day seen before the pandemic. Now, as for Brazil, I understand around 30 crude oil projects are expected to start operations from this year until 2025. Just to name a few from top of my head, Buzios, Lula, Oeste. These are some of the key projects in the country that are expected to handsomely contribute to the global supply increase over the next few years. And to address your second question there, why OPEC is so stubborn, right? Well, two reasons come to my mind quickly. Firstly, you have to remember, unlike the US, many of the OPEC producers, they depend heavily on their oil revenue. Obviously, the OPEC producers know the pain of ultra-low oil prices of 2020 and how that seriously hit their national budget and government finances. So the very cautious approach in production control they're adopting, it does make sense after that big painful lesson learned on massive oversupply of 2020. And lastly, the second reason is due mainly to what I call a wildcard Iran. If nuclear talks progress well and eventually set the stage for lifting of the sanctions on Tehran, that's going to allow up to 1.3 million barrels a day of Iranian oil returning to the market. So in a way, OPEC Plus strategy is to maintain the relatively tight market condition in a way to create that buffer against Iranian oil possibly flooding back to the market eventually one day.
Right, so there is a lot of finger pointing going on. It's fair to say OPEC doesn't want to give an inch due to the reasons you just mentioned there. But what, if any, financial, political, diplomatic tools does the Biden administration have in its arsenal should it decide, look, enough is enough, we can't handle this anymore, and it's time to force OPEC's hand?
Right. Well, I guess one quick solution is to, again, it's that wild card Iran. So play that Iranian card, because the return of that massive volume of Iranian oil, it all depends on the US at the end of the day, right? So if Washington could make extra efforts to wrap up this nuclear talks once and for all, and eventually let the Iranian oil flood the market once again. And apart from that, I guess the US could surely take full advantage of its diplomatic power and big oil majors' business know-how to form some sort of a separate group or an organization of petroleum-producing nations within the North, Central, and South Americas. Now, this idea actually came from one of the Chevron executives that I met a few years ago. Now, when you consider the US, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and the Americas, this group put together has quite a sizable production capacity combined. And if they could continue, if they could convince Venezuela even to leave the OPEC and join them, that would be a big bonus, obviously. Now, the idea is to really form some sort of a competitor organization to OPEC. Now, producers in the Americas, they have stellar marketing power in Asia now, and they could seriously increase competition with the Middle Eastern producers. So, yeah, the idea of producers in the Americas forming a separate competing organization to OPEC. Now, if Washington can somewhat just simply suggest or throw such idea in any major global summits or meetings, that will definitely keep big OPEC producers on their toes for sure.
Well, before we let you go, finally, South Korea has another problem, namely a shortage of urea water solution, a chemical needed to power diesel vehicles. And China is the country's biggest supplier, but China is facing its own energy crisis, so it has curbed exports. Does Seoul have time to find urea from other countries? And do you think it was an oversight to rely so heavily on China in the first place?
Right. So I understand South Korea practically stopped producing urea water solution or diesel exhaust fluid. Let's just call it DEF around a decade ago. I wouldn't blame anyone for this because DEF is such a low value product with very little margins and profitability. Now, for South Korea's very highly sophisticated refineries and chemical plants, it will be an absolute waste to be making such low-end product, and they're better off just keep on focusing on manufacturing and producing high-end liquid fuels and chemicals. So at the end of the day, it's all down to the economics, right? I mean, if it's cheaper to import rather than producing it, then be it. That's how the market functions. Now, your question on has South Korea been relying too much on China for DEF? Yes, perhaps, but one thing is clear. DEF is not some sort of a precious or very rare commodity or anything. It can easily be sourced from all across the world. As I mentioned earlier, DEF is a very low-end, low-value product. Practically any country can produce it. There are many, in fact, DEF manufacturers across Southeast Asia, South Asia, Oceania, the U.S. So yes, it was cost-effective and efficient to import from China in a massive bulk, but troublesome it may be, South Korea will have little problem resorting to diversification of DEF supply sources, and well, they just have to increase the frequency in the shipments too, I guess. So no real panic.
Yeah, well, Philip, I'm sure what you just said there is music to the ears of many a truck driver here in South Korea, because a lot of them are particularly worried at the minute. But we appreciate your insights, and hopefully we'll get to speak to you again soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks. South Korea's Son Heung-min scored his 30th goal for his country Tuesday, helping the Taeguk Warriors to a comfortable 3-0 win against Iraq in their latest qualifying match for the 2022 World Cup. The victory in Doha extends South Korea's undefeated streak to 6 matches, leaving them with 14 points from 4 wins and 2 draws. With the group's leader Iran beating Syria 3-0, South Korea remains second in Group A and on track to qualify for the World Cup. Sesame Street, a long-time favourite of children and even, you might say, some adults around the world for more than 50 years now, is introducing its first ever Asian American character. Kim Bok-young reports.
Meet 7-year-old Ji-young, the very first Asian American resident of Sesame Street.
Actually, there's something really cool about my name. So in Korean, traditionally, the 2 syllables, they each mean something different. And Chi means like smart or wise, and young means like brave or courageous or strong. Yeah.
Just a young kid who likes playing the electric guitar and cooking with her grandma, but Ji-young is already making history as the first Asian American Muppet featured on Sesame Street in the show's 50-year history. The new Asian American character is a part of the organization's ongoing racial justice initiative called Coming Together, which was introduced in the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd and as racism and violence targeting Asians and Asian Americans surged during the pandemic. Some of Ji-young's personality actually comes from Ji-young's own puppeteer, Kitlin Kim. This 41-year-old Korean American got into puppetry in her 30s, and in 2014, she was accepted into a Sesame Street workshop. The new character is the culmination of a lot of discussions following the many race-related hate crimes that took place in 2020. And so, Kim hopes that Ji-young's existence can deliver a message of inclusivity.
My one hope, obviously, is to have Ji-young help teach, what racism is, help teach kids to be able to recognize it and then speak out against it. But then my other hope for Ji-young is that she just normalizes seeing different kinds of looking kids on TV.
Ji-young will be formally introduced in the Sesame Street special called See Us Coming Together, which will air on Thanksgiving Day, November 25th, on HBO Max, Sesame Street's social media platforms, and on local PBS stations. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. Russia on Tuesday confirmed that it conducted a missile test targeting an old space satellite, blowing up their target and creating debris that forced the International Space Station crew to shelter in capsules. In response, Washington condemned Moscow's action, calling it a dangerous and irresponsible missile test.
Russia's dangerous and irresponsible behavior jeopardizes the long-term sustainability of our outer space and clearly demonstrates that Russia's claims of opposing the weaponization of space are disingenuous and hypocritical. The United States will work with our allies and partners to respond to Russia's irresponsible act.
Experts also say that weapons that shatter satellites pose a space hazard, as the resulting clouds of fragments can collide with other objects, setting off a chain reaction of projectiles through the Earth's orbit. The latest missile test reportedly created more than 1,500 pieces of orbital debris. However, in response, the Russian Space Agency downplayed the situation, saying that the missile test was incident-free. The satellite targeted for the test was the Cosmos 1408, a spy satellite launched in 1982, which stopped working many years ago. Myanmar's military authorities continue to add fresh charges against the ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi, as well as members of her administration. According to a state media announcement on Tuesday, the Nobel Prize winner is now facing a new electoral fraud charge, along with 15 others. The 76-year-old faces 11 criminal charges, including 2 for corruption and 1 for violating the Official Secrets Act, which could see her sentenced to a maximum of more than 100 years in prison. She has been held captive by the military since the February coup, when the military justified their takeover by accusing her government of obtaining a landslide election victory through a manipulated vote. Bitcoin on Tuesday slipped below $60,000, seeing losses from a record high of $69,000 recorded a week earlier. The world's biggest cryptocurrency saw its price drop to as low as $58,568, the lowest in more than 2 weeks. Ethereum also saw a huge drop in prices, down 6.8% at one point. Analysts say they can't pinpoint any particular news driving the massive declines, but added it seems to be driven by profit-taking after a recent sharp run-up. Bitcoin has still more than doubled in value since June, thanks to mainstream adoption of cryptocurrencies. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Good morning. It's a colder start to the day. Inland regions saw morning lows dropping to below freezing. And of course, that's including Daegwallyeong in Gangwon-do province. And highs this afternoon will be similar to slightly lower than yesterday. Chuncheon is also waking up to sub-zero morning temperatures, and Daejeon and Daegu at 2 degrees Celsius. Lots of sunshine to begin the day. Then air quality will be normal in most parts of the country, except in Chungcheongbuk-do province and Daegu. Meanwhile, a dry weather advisory remains in place in East Coast regions for a week now. And along with cold wind, please be careful with anything that can cause a fire. Then daily highs will be a couple degrees higher than season norms this afternoon. While tomorrow is a big day for test takers, as Suneung, or the college entrance exam, will take place. Central regions will receive light rain, while there will not be a sudden cold snap on a test day. Then wet conditions on Sunday, and next Monday will bring a real winter air to the country. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
Well, that's where we're going to wrap up this Wednesday edition of New Day at Arirang. Thank you for spending the past hour or so with us. I'm Mark Broom.
And I'm Kim Mo-gyan. Mark will be back in an hour with more news, and both of us will be back here same time Thursday for another edition of New Day at Arirang. Till then, goodbye.